It was a bright summer morning in London, and the wide space outside Buckingham Palace was already full of life. Tourists had gathered from all around the world. Cameras clicked non-stop as people tried to capture the tall red uniforms and the shiny black boots of the famous royal guards. The large black hats on their heads made them look even taller, almost like statues that had come alive. For many, this was the highlight of their trip, a moment to see tradition standing firm in the modern world. Among the crowd, a little boy stood holding his mother's hand tightly at first. His name was Ethan, only 6 years old, with bright brown eyes and a toy car tucked carefully in his small palm. His mother, Sarah, had promised him this trip for weeks, saying, "You'll see real soldiers who don't even blink." Ethan had laughed at the thought, wondering how anyone could stand so still for so long. They had taken a train early in the morning, walked through busy streets, and finally reached the palace gates where the guards lined up with perfect discipline. The air was full of excitement. Children sat on their parents' shoulders to get a better view. Street performers played music not far away, while pigeons circled above the wide courtyard. The sun reflected on the palace windows and everything seemed bigger, brighter, and more magical to little Ethan. He squeezed his toy car between his fingers and tried to stretch on his toes, hoping to see the guards better. Then, as often happens in crowded places, things moved quickly. Sarah bent slightly to check her bag for her phone, distracted for only a few seconds. In that small window of time, Ethan saw a balloon floating across the courtyard, carried by the breeze. It belonged to another child, but Ethan's eyes followed it without thinking. He took one step forward, then another, not realizing that his hand had slipped out of his mother's grasp. The balloon drifted, and Ethan's tiny legs tried to chase the sight of it. When Sarah looked up, her heart sank. The small hand that had been in hers only moments ago was gone. "Ethan!" She called out quickly, her voice sharp with panic. She turned left and right, pushing gently through the people beside her. At first she thought he might only be hiding behind a taller tourist, but as seconds passed, she realized her son had wandered into the thick crowd. Ethan, meanwhile, had stopped walking. The balloon had floated too high to catch, and now he was lost in a sea of legs and voices. He looked around, eyes wide, his toy car trembling in his grip. He could no longer see his mother's face, only strangers moving in every direction. The cheerful noise of the crowd now sounded frightening to him. The more he turned, the more lost he felt. He thought of calling for his mother, but his voice seemed small compared to the loud chatter and camera clicks. He tried again, "Mom!" but the word faded quickly in the noise. A wave of fear rose inside him. He hugged his toy car to his chest like a shield, and his lower lip began to tremble. His small wandering steps brought him closer to the line of royal guards. They stood tall, rifles held firmly, their faces serious and still. They did not move, not even when the crowd pressed closer for pictures. To Ethan, they looked both scary and safe at the same time. He inched nearer, tears now rolling down his cheeks. Tourists noticed him. A few pointed, whispering to each other, unsure what to do. Everyone knew the rule. You don't disturb the guards. They never break character, never move or speak unless it is serious. But here was a small child, clearly lost and frightened, standing almost at the boots of one of the soldiers. Sarah's voice carried faintly across the courtyard again. She had managed to climb onto the edge of a stone step, scanning the crowd. "Ethan!" she cried, her voice cracking. She pushed her way forward, but every second felt like forever. Her hands shook as she tried to part the crowd. Her heart raced with fear, imagining every terrible possibility. Ethan looked toward the sound of her voice, but he couldn't see her. He pressed his little hand against his eyes to wipe away tears. Then, almost without meaning to, he stepped so close that his shoulder brushed against the leg of a guard's uniform. The tall soldier remained still, but inside he had already noticed the boy. His training told him to stay unmoving, to remain part of the line. But the sight of the child's trembling shoulders tugged at something deeper, something human. The scene around them slowed. Tourists held their breath, unsure of what would happen next. Was the guard going to remain a statue as tradition demanded? Or would he notice the child's quiet cry for help? No one dared cross the line themselves because they knew guards often warned people away for stepping too close. For Ethan, the guard was the only figure that seemed solid in the middle of his confusion. The boy tilted his face up, his cheeks wet with tears, and stared at the tall soldier. His lips quivered as he whispered softly, "I want my mom." The guard's eyes shifted ever so slightly downward, enough to see the boy clearly. Behind the still mask of duty, there was the heart of a man who understood what it meant to be lost as a child. His rifle rested firmly in place, but his mind was no longer on the drill. He knew the rules. He knew thousands of tourists expected him to stay silent and still. Yet here was a little boy, no taller than his knees, looking at him with desperate eyes. In that moment, the air was thick with tension. People whispered. Sarah kept calling, and Ethan clutched his toy car like it was his last comfort. Everything seemed to hang on whether the guard would move or not. The moment stretched long, but in truth it was only a few seconds. The guard drew a slow breath, steadying himself between duty and compassion, and as Ethan looked up at him again, something remarkable was about to happen, something no one in the crowd would ever forget. The crowd outside Buckingham Palace continued to buzz with excitement. Tourists were still snapping photos, pointing toward the guards and whispering in awe. Yet in the middle of all that noise, a little boy's soft cries went almost unnoticed. Ethan stood just a few steps away from the tall line of royal guards. His small hands rubbed at his eyes, his cheeks wet, and his toy car almost slipping from his grip. He looked so out of place against the backdrop of the grand soldiers who never moved. Nearby, whispers started to spread among the tourists. A couple from Spain pointed toward him and murmured in their language. A young woman from America raised her phone, unsure if she should record what she was seeing. People knew how rare it was for anything to interrupt the guard's rigid stillness. But here was a child, visibly lost and afraid, standing close to them. Many wondered, would the guards do something? Ethan turned in circles, hoping to spot his mother's familiar face. Everywhere he looked, he only saw strangers. Some taller, some with hats, some bending down to take pictures. None of them were his mom. The balloon that had led him away was long gone, floating high and out of sight. He felt smaller with each passing second, almost swallowed up by the large crowd. His chest felt heavy, and his throat hurt from calling out. Not too far away, Sarah was still searching wildly. She pushed past people as quickly as she could, her voice growing hoarse from shouting her son's name. "Ethan!" she called again, her eyes darting left and right. Her heart pounded against her chest so hard she could barely breathe. Fear filled her mind. What if she couldn't find him? What if he had gone too far? But she refused to stop. A mother's instinct kept her moving, no matter how many people stood in her way. Meanwhile, Ethan had drifted even closer to the guards. One of them, a tall soldier with broad shoulders, kept his eyes straight ahead as training required. But he had already noticed the child. His grip on his rifle stayed firm, his posture stiff, but his heart was not made of stone. He could hear the faint sobs near his boots. And though he had been told never to react unless ordered, something inside him began to stir. The boy's toy car slipped from his sweaty little hands and clattered onto the stones. The sharp sound caught the attention of several nearby tourists. A hush seemed to spread in the small circle around him. Ethan bent to pick it up but paused halfway, too overwhelmed to move quickly. He hugged the car to his chest again, as if it were his only friend in the world. His small voice rose again, shaky and weak. "Mom, where are you?" The words were almost drowned out by the crowd, but they reached the ears of the tourists nearby. Some people frowned, wishing they could help, but everyone hesitated. They all knew the line near the guards was like an invisible barrier. To cross it would risk being shouted at or escorted away, so they stood still, waiting, hoping something would happen soon. Sarah's voice called once more, sharper and more desperate this time. "Ethan!" Her cry carried over the heads of the crowd, and Ethan's head jerked up. His eyes widened as he recognized the voice, but he still couldn't see her. The tears blurred his vision, and the moving sea of bodies kept blocking the path. He pressed closer to the one figure who looked steady, the guard. The guard's eyes shifted ever so slightly downward again. Behind his stern expression, he was battling with himself. His entire life as a soldier had been built on discipline. He had been told again and again, no matter what happens, you stand still. No matter how loud the noise, no matter how close the tourists, you remain like a statue. But standing there with a little boy leaning almost against his leg, that training suddenly felt smaller than the beating of his own heart. The boy sniffled loudly, clutching his car, and whispered, "Please help me." Those words broke something inside the soldier. He thought of his own younger brother years ago who once got lost at a fair. He remembered the panic on his mother's face, The same panic he now heard in the voice of this boy's mother somewhere in the crowd. For a moment, he was no longer just a guard in a red uniform. He was a man, and before him was a frightened child who needed someone. The tourists sensed the shift. They leaned forward slightly, some holding their breath, others raising their cameras. A woman near the front whispered, "Is he going to move?" Nobody wanted to miss what might happen next. Ethan's tears rolled down faster now, his cheeks shining in the sunlight. He hugged his toy car tightly, but it was not enough to make him feel safe. The guard's hand twitched ever so slightly on his rifle, a movement so small most people wouldn't notice, but to him, it was a step closer to making a choice. At that exact moment, Sarah finally pushed her way closer, though she was still several feet behind the barrier of people. She spotted her son's small figure near the guard, and her heart leaped. Relief and fear battled inside her chest. She shouted again, louder than ever, "Ethan, stay right there!" The boy turned his head quickly, his eyes searching. He thought he had heard her voice closer this time. His lips trembled, and he raised his toy car as if to wave it in the air. "Mom!" he shouted back, his little voice cracking. The guard's ears picked up the exchange. He knew this was the mother, and he could see her struggling desperately through the crowd. The boy was only feet away from breaking down completely. A choice had to be made. The soldier stood rigid, his chest rising and falling beneath the heavy uniform. The tradition of centuries weighed on one side of him, the unspoken rules that every guard followed. On the other side was a child's cry, pure and fragile, cutting straight to the heart. The crowd grew silent, sensing that something extraordinary was about to take place. Ethan's small hand brushed once more against the guard's leg. His wide eyes, red from tears, stared upward with a plea no words could fully capture. The soldier drew in a breath. This was no longer about ceremony or protocol. It was about kindness. And in that moment, the entire crowd leaned into the stillness, waiting to see whether duty or humanity would win. The soldier stood still, his tall frame unshaken, but inside his heart was racing. The training that had been drilled into him for years echoed in his head. Never move, never break, never speak. Yet just beneath him was a small child, helpless and afraid, looking at him as though he were the only safe person left in the world. The boy's small hand brushed lightly against the edge of his red uniform, and in that simple touch, everything changed. Ethan's tearful eyes begged for comfort. He clutched his toy car so tightly that his little fingers turned pale, but the car could not hug him back, could not wipe his tears, could not lead him to his mother. He whispered again, almost too soft for anyone else to hear, "Please help me." The words hit the guard like an arrow. He remembered his own childhood, his younger cousins who had often wandered off during family outings, the way panic filled the air until they were safely found. In that instant, the guard was no longer just a silent soldier in a grand ceremony. He was a man faced with a choice that could not wait. Around them, the crowd had fallen quieter, sensing that something rare and important was about to happen. Some tourists still held up their phones, recording nervously. Others simply stared wide-eyed, wondering if the impossible was about to occur. Even the pigeons that had been fluttering above seemed to slow their circling, as if nature itself was pausing. The guard's chest rose and fell with a deep breath. His eyes, usually fixed straight ahead, lowered toward the boy. The stillness of his body broke as he shifted slightly, a movement so small yet so significant that the crowd gasped. A royal guard had moved without command. Ethan blinked up at him, his tears halting for just a moment in surprise. The soldier's hand, strong yet gentle, lowered slowly from his rifle. His voice, steady and calm, came forth like a secret revealed. "It's all right, little one," he said softly. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The royal guards were famous for their silence, for their unshakable discipline. Yet here was a soldier speaking directly to a child, his tone carrying warmth instead of authority. The boy's lip trembled, but his shoulders eased at the sound. For the first time since he had lost his mother, Ethan felt like someone understood. The soldier crouched slightly, breaking another rule, so that his tall figure would not seem so towering. He was still careful, still respectful of his duty. But in this moment, humanity took the lead. Ethan's eyes widened as the soldier leaned closer. "Don't be afraid," the guard whispered. "We'll find your mom." Ethan nodded weakly, wiping his cheeks with the back of his hand. His toy car clattered again as his grip loosened, but the soldier reached out and steadied it with one gloved hand, handing it back carefully. It was such a small act, but to Ethan it felt like a promise that he would not be left alone. By now, Sarah had managed to push through closer to the barrier of people. She saw her son's small figure standing with the guard bent down near him, and her knees almost gave way with relief. "Ethan!" she shouted, her voice breaking. The boy's head jerked toward the sound, but the crowd between them still made it impossible for him to reach her. The guard noticed the mother, her face pale and desperate, her hand stretching out as far as it could go from behind the crowd. He knew then that his decision was made. He could not leave the child to suffer even a second longer. With a deliberate motion, the soldier straightened himself. He lowered his rifle carefully, holding it to one side in a gesture of safety rather than power. Then, breaking centuries of tradition, he took a single step out of line. The sound of his boot against the stone rang louder than any drum. The tourists gasped again. Some even clapped their hands over their mouths. This was no ordinary moment. The boy's eyes followed the guard's movement, his fear beginning to melt into hope. The soldier extended one strong hand, palm open. Ethan hesitated for only a second before placing his tiny fingers into it. The contrast was striking. The guard's hand large, steady and powerful, the boy's hand small, trembling, and innocent. Together they stood, and the guard guided Ethan gently out from the invisible barrier of tradition into the arms of his waiting mother. The crowd's silence was thick, but in the middle of it there was a quiet sense of respect. No one moved. No one spoke, for they all understood that they were witnessing something deeply human. Sarah's tears flowed freely as she stretched her arms out. The guard led Ethan through the last steps, placing him directly in her embrace. The boy let out a small sob of relief as he buried his face into his mother's chest. Sarah hugged him tightly, almost as if she would never let go again. The guard gave a small nod as if to say the mission was complete. His face remained composed, but in his eyes there was a flicker of warmth. Sarah looked up at him with gratitude too deep for words. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaking. The crowd, unable to hold their emotions any longer, began to clap softly. It was not the applause of tourists admiring a performance, but the applause of people touched by kindness. Phones clicked, videos captured, but more importantly, hearts remembered. The soldier did not bask in the attention. He simply returned to his place in line, lifting his rifle once more, his posture as rigid and professional as before. To anyone who had just arrived, it looked as though nothing had happened. Yet everyone who had witnessed it knew better. They had seen a man choose compassion over protocol, love over tradition, humanity over ceremony. For Ethan, the memory would stay forever. The toy car, now safely in his pocket, would always remind him of the tall soldier who bent down and spoke kind words when he felt the most alone. For Sarah, it was the moment she learned that even the strictest rules could bend when a child's safety was at stake. The tourists who left that day carried more than pictures. They carried a story of rare courage, one they would tell their families back home. The day a royal guard broke silence, broke stillness, broke tradition, all to help a lost boy find his mother. And though the guard never spoke another word that day, his actions had already spoken louder than any ceremony ever could. The air outside Buckingham Palace was heavy with silence after the guard's surprising choice. For a few heartbeats, it felt as though the world itself had paused. A moment earlier, people had been laughing, talking, and taking pictures. Now they stood frozen, holding their phones without pressing the button, staring at the sight of the soldier stepping forward with a child's hand in his. Even the pigeons seemed to glide slower in the sky, as if they too understood that something unusual and powerful had taken place. Ethan's tiny hand clung tightly to the guard's large gloved one. He no longer looked as frightened as before. The tears still sparkled on his cheeks, but his eyes carried a new trust. His toy car was pressed against his chest with his other hand, almost like a treasure he had kept safe through the storm of confusion. The guard's firm but gentle grip steadied him, making him feel that he was no longer lost. The soldier walked slowly but surely, guiding the boy forward. His tall figure, once stiff as a statue, now moved with calm purpose. Every step echoed softly on the stones, each one breaking centuries of unshaken tradition. People gasped quietly, their eyes following him. A few lifted their phones again, realizing they were witnessing a moment that would be told and retold long after this day. At the edge of the crowd, Sarah finally broke through. Her face was pale from worry, her hair a little messy from pushing past strangers, but her eyes shone with hope when she saw Ethan walking with the guard. She raised her arms wide, her voice cracking with relief. "Ethan!" she cried out louder than she ever had before. The boy's face lit up at the sound. He dropped his toy car into his pocket and tugged at the guard's hand, wanting to run, but the soldier kept a steady pace, protecting him as he guided him through the space between the curious onlookers. Slowly, they reached Sarah. The moment Ethan fell into his mother's arms, the air shifted completely. Sarah dropped to her knees, hugging her son as though she might never let him go again. Her tears flowed freely, wetting his hair as she kissed the top of his head again and again. "You scared me so much," she whispered into his ear. Ethan clung to her neck, his little arms squeezing tightly, and mumbled through his tears, "I thought I lost you, Mom." The guard stood nearby, watching the reunion with steady eyes. His expression remained disciplined, but in his chest he felt a wave of quiet satisfaction. He had broken protocol, yes, but he had chosen humanity. Seeing the boy safe in his mother's arms made every risk worth it. The crowd around them could no longer hold back. Applause began, first as a soft ripple, then growing into a wave. Tourists clapped their hands with respect, some even wiping away tears. Many had traveled far to see a ceremonial guard stand unshaken, but what they had seen instead touched them more deeply than any performance. They had witnessed kindness win over rule, and that was a memory worth carrying home. Sarah looked up at the guard, her face wet with tears, her voice trembling. "Thank you," she said, her words small but filled with more meaning than any speech. "You don't know what this means to me." The soldier gave her a small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement. He did not speak. His one break of silence had been for the boy alone, but his eyes told her everything. He understood, and he shared in her relief. Ethan lifted his head from his mother's shoulder just enough to look at the guard. In his young heart he felt awe for this tall figure who had reached down to him in his moment of fear. With a shy smile, the boy whispered, "Thank you, mister." His voice was quiet, but the guard heard it clearly. He gave the boy the faintest nod, then returned his gaze forward, his duty calling him back. Slowly, with controlled movements, the guard stepped back into line. His rifle returned to its place, his posture straightened, and once again he looked like a statue carved from history. To anyone arriving late, it would appear as though nothing had happened at all. Yet for those who had seen it, everything had changed. Sarah sat back on her heels, still holding Ethan, her heart calming slowly. Around her, strangers smiled and offered words of comfort. A man in a blue jacket said, "You're very lucky." A woman holding a camera added softly, "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen here." Sarah nodded through her tears, grateful beyond words. Ethan pulled back slightly, looking at his mother with wide eyes. "Mom, he talked to me," he said in wonder, his small voice filled with pride. "The guard talked to me." Sarah's breath caught at that. She knew how rare and almost impossible it was. She hugged him again, whispering, "He did because he cared about you." As the applause faded, people began to lower their phones, though many kept glancing at the guard, still amazed by what they had seen. They whispered to each other in many languages, retelling the moment as though it were already a story they would carry home. For the rest of the ceremony, the line of guards remained perfectly still. The soldiers beside the one who had broken formation never shifted, never turned. But deep inside, they too must have felt a swell of quiet pride. They had witnessed their fellow guards step beyond tradition for the sake of a child, and no soldier could find fault in that. The sun moved higher in the sky, casting golden light across the palace gates. The moment of panic had passed, replaced now with calm. Sarah finally stood, holding Ethan's hand tightly in hers, determined not to let go again. Together they stepped back from the crowd, her heart still racing but filled with relief. She turned one last time to look at the guard who had helped her son. He stood once again in his rigid stance, silent and tall, yet in her eyes he no longer looked like just a ceremonial soldier. He looked like a hero. She squeezed Ethan's hand gently and whispered, "Never forget this, my love. Sometimes rules are important, but kindness is greater." The boy nodded, still clutching his toy car. He glanced back too, his young mind already forming the memory that would stay with him forever. The soldier had seemed so serious, so unreachable, yet in the moment when he needed him most, the guard had shown him compassion. The crowd slowly returned to its normal hum of excitement. Tourists who had seen the scene began to walk away, some shaking their heads in wonder, others still wiping their eyes. But all of them carried a story that they would tell for years. The day a royal guard broke protocol to reunite a little boy with his mother, And though the guard himself never moved again for the rest of his shift, never smiled, never spoke another word, his actions had already said more than any words could. The day outside Buckingham Palace slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but for those who had witnessed what had happened, nothing felt ordinary anymore. The famous courtyard, known for its strict ceremonies and soldiers who never broke formation, had become the stage for a story that touched hearts deeper than any performance. The crowd still buzzed, though now with softer voices, as if people were reluctant to let go of the emotion they had just experienced. Sarah held Ethan close as they stepped back from the thickest part of the crowd. She kept her hand tightly wrapped around his, almost afraid that if she loosened her grip, he might slip away again. Her heart was still recovering from the rush of fear that had gripped her only minutes earlier. She bent slightly, brushing the hair away from Ethan's damp cheeks, and whispered, "I've got you, sweetheart. You're safe now." Ethan nodded, his small fingers squeezing hers in return. His toy car was still in his pocket, and he patted it gently as though it had become part of the memory he never wanted to lose. "Mom," he said softly, looking up at her with wide eyes. "The guard talked to me. He said it would be okay." Sarah's eyes welled again, this time not from fear but from gratitude. She crouched down so that her face was level with her son's and whispered, "That's because he cared about you. Even when he wasn't supposed to move, he chose to help you. That's something you'll never forget." All around them, tourists were still whispering. A man from Germany shook his head in disbelief as he told his wife, "I've been here 3 times and I've never seen a guard do that." A young girl tugged her father's sleeve, saying, "Did you see? He bent down and helped the boy." Even those who hadn't caught the full moment leaned in to hear the retellings, realizing they had just missed something extraordinary. Several tourists clapped again, this time more softly, almost like a farewell to the scene. Some people lowered their phones and promised themselves they wouldn't just keep the video, they would share the story, because the true beauty of the moment wasn't just in seeing it, but in telling others how compassion had broken through unshakable tradition. Ethan glanced back at the guards, his eyes fixed on the one who had bent down to him. The soldier now stood as still as stone again, rifle in hand, his gaze forward, his face unreadable. To anyone else, it looked as though nothing had happened, but to Ethan it felt like he was looking at a hero. The boy whispered quietly, almost to himself, "He's brave." Sarah followed her son's gaze and smiled faintly through her tears. She knew the guard could not respond, could not smile back or wave, but she also knew he had already given her and her son more than enough. She lifted Ethan into her arms and said gently, "Let's go, my love. This will be our special story forever." As they turned to leave, Ethan rested his head on her shoulder, still peeking one last time at the tall soldier in the red uniform. The moment was burned into his young mind, the fear of being lost, the kindness of a stranger, the reunion with his mother, and the applause of people from all over the world. He didn't understand all of it, but he knew one thing. He would remember the guard's voice for the rest of his life. The guard, though silent once more, felt a quiet warmth in his chest. He would not speak of it later. Guards rarely discussed the details of their shifts, yet inside he knew he had done something right. He had honored not only his duty as a soldier, but his duty as a human being. Protocol was important, but compassion had proven stronger. Hours later, when the ceremony ended and the guards marched away with their boots striking the ground in perfect rhythm, the tourists clapped again. But this time, for many of them, the memory of the day was not about the polished drills or the sharp uniforms. It was about the moment one guard stepped forward, broke the rules, and reached out to a crying child. That evening, Sarah sat with Ethan in their small London hotel room. She tucked him into bed and kissed his forehead. He was already drifting off to sleep, but before he closed his eyes fully, he whispered, "Mom, can we come back one day? I want to see him again." Sarah stroked his hair and said softly, "Maybe one day we will. But even if we don't, you'll always carry him in your heart." Ethan smiled faintly, his eyes closing, safe in the knowledge that he had been found. For Sarah, the story became something she would tell for years to come. At family gatherings, she would share how a royal guard, famous for his silence, had broken his stillness to return her son to her arms. Friends would shake their heads in wonder, saying they couldn't imagine such a thing, and every time she told it, she would relive that rush of relief when she hugged Ethan again. The tourists, too, carried the story back to their corners of the world. In kitchens, classrooms, and offices, people heard about the day a soldier in London bent the rules for the sake of kindness. Some saw the videos online, where the story spread quietly, not as a scandal but as a reminder of humanity. It wasn't about breaking tradition. It was about remembering that rules exist to protect people, and sometimes protecting a child means putting kindness first. And as for the guard, he never told his part of the story. His life returned to its rhythm of discipline and duty, his face set in the familiar stillness of his role. Yet, deep in his heart, he carried the memory of the small boy's trembling voice in the moment when he chose to act. Perhaps he thought of it on quieter days when the palace square was less crowded. Perhaps he thought of it when he saw children smiling at the guards from a safe distance. It was a memory that belonged to him as much as it belonged to Ethan and Sarah. The palace itself remained the same, standing tall and regal, its gates opening and closing, its guards rotating in perfect sequence. But for those who had been there on that summer day, it held something more. To them, Buckingham Palace was not just a symbol of tradition and power. It was also the place where they saw kindness break through ceremony, where they saw a soldier become a hero, and where a mother and child were reunited in front of the world. For Ethan, the story grew with him. As he got older, he told it to classmates, later to friends, and perhaps one day he would tell it to his own children. Each time he would describe the tall soldier who seemed so unmovable, but who bent down just for him. Each time his eyes would brighten with the same awe he felt that day. In the end, it was more than just a story about a lost boy and a worried mother. It became a reminder to everyone who heard it, that even in places where rules seem stronger than feelings, compassion can still shine through. It reminded people that behind every uniform, behind every duty, there is a human heart that can choose kindness. And so the memory lived on. In the quiet heart of a mother, in the young soul of a boy, in the whispers of tourists who had clapped with teary eyes, and even in the silent pride of a soldier who returned to his post. It was a story without a headline in history books, but one that carried more weight than many grand events. It was a story of love, fear, courage, and reunion. A story that proved sometimes the smallest choices create the most lasting memories.